Lonely Baron hired a girl to watch his cattle, didn't know she could ride better than any man and heal a broken man. Texas Panhandle, spring 1873. The wind rolled low over the grassland, sweeping dust and silence across the endless plains. The sun hung heavy in the sky, caught between gold and fire, casting long shadows from the fence posts that stretched like ribs into the horizon. This was cattle country, hard land for harder men, and Colton Harlow owned more of it than anyone could count. At 32, Colton was a man made from stillness and stone. His wife had died 5 years ago, birthing a child that never breathed. Since then he had spoken less and worked more, building his empire of cattle and contracts while saying next to nothing. The locals called him the Cold Baron, not cruel, just unreachable. Even the wind did not bother him. His ranch, the Harlow Range, sprawled over 60,000 acres, dotted with mesquite and creek beds. The war had taken most of the able-bodied men, and those who came back often did not stay long. Some died in gunfights. Others vanished into gambling debts and bottle bottoms. The few who remained were overworked, underfed, and too scared to quit. By spring, the herds had grown restless. Too many mouths, not enough hands. Colton rode into the nearest town, posted a notice on the saloon wall. Ranch help needed. Must ride, rope, and work alone. No questions asked. Room and board. No one came for 3 weeks. Then, one late afternoon, as the dust settled low along the fences and the cattle bellowed toward the creek, a single rider appeared on the southern ridge, slim, upright, no hat. The horse moved like it had been raised on wind and thunder. The rider did not sway. Colton watched from the porch. He narrowed his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. The rider approached the front gate without hesitation. A woman, young, dust-covered. She swung off the saddle with a fluid motion and pushed open the gate like she had every right. "My name's June Haynes," she said. "I saw your notice." Her voice was low, steady, with no trace of doubt. Colton studied her. "I am not hiring maids," he said flatly. "I am not one," she replied. "My father was Will Haynes. He worked for you before he got shot guarding your herd outside Clay River. I ride, I rope, and I do not spook easy." Colton stared at her. He remembered Will, quiet man, good with his hands, shot in the gut by rustlers who got away. Colton had paid for the box and the hole, but never met the girl. "You are his daughter?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "and I do not want charity, just work." "You got a place to stay?" "Not unless you count the trail behind me." He looked past her to the ridge. There was nothing. No wagon, no pack mule, just her and the horse. "You can try for a week," he said. "If you slow down the work, you ride out." June nodded once. "Fair." He pointed to the bunkhouse. "Lodge is full. You take the shed next to the water tower. Meals at dawn and sundown." She nodded again and turned to lead her horse that way. Did not thank him, did not smile. Colton watched her go, one brow slightly raised. The other men in the yard stared, some snorting, others whispering. None of them moved to help her unload her gear. She did not ask them to. The sun dipped lower. The next morning, before light, she was already out by the corral. By noon, the men had gathered near the western slope to begin sorting the cattle for spring drive. A narrow path curved up the rise, rough and half-washed from a recent rain. One steer had broken free and was making toward the far ridge. Before any man could mount, June was already moving. Bareback. She leapt atop her horse, no saddle, only a rope for grip, and charged up the slope. The beast below her answered the command in her knees. They flew, man and mount, over brush and stone, cutting off the steer at full gallop, turning it clean with a whistle and a flick of the reins. She brought it down the hill like it had been waiting for her all morning. The cowhands stood frozen. "Damn," one of them muttered. "She rides better than any man here." From the porch, Colton watched without expression, but his hand, resting on the arm of the chair, had curled slightly tighter. And for the first time in years, his eyes followed someone instead of turning away. The shed next to the water tower had no windows and a door that creaked like an old prayer. But June never asked for more. She swept it clean, laid her blanket down over a bale of straw, and hung her saddlebag on a bent nail in the wall. No fuss, no complaint. She ate her meals in silence, rose before dawn, and kept to herself. In a place full of men who shouted to prove they mattered, her quiet was a kind of defiance. She did not waste time. On the second day, she approached the corral where the worst of the ranch horses, a broad-chested bay named Devil's Echo, had earned a reputation for breaking more bones than boards. No one rode him, not after the last hand walked with a limp he would never shake. June stood at the edge of the corral, eyes steady. Then, without asking, she climbed the fence, dropped into the dust, and faced the beast. The horse snorted, pawed the dirt. Colton watched from the barn door, arms crossed. What followed was not force, it was negotiation. She let the stallion circle, let it test her. Then, slow as the sunrise, she moved forward, hand extended. By the time the third day came, she was riding him bareback across the pasture. The men whistled. One said, "She must be half-wind herself." June said nothing. By the end of the week, she had reorganized the way the cattle were driven down the eastern ravine. She rerouted the herd path to avoid a rocky bend that had lamed 3 calves last season. Her system used fewer hands, and half the time. The other cowhands started copying her without even noticing. Colton said little, but he watched everything, from the porch, from the barn. His silence shifted, no longer the silence of suspicion, but the silence of curiosity. She never joked, never lingered, but she noticed. She noticed when the cook left his apron dirty and cleaned it without a word. She noticed when the youngest hand cried out from a snakebite dream and left a bottle of lavender water by his cot. At dinner she sat near the end of the long table. She never asked for seconds, never interrupted. But her eyes scanned each man, measuring, understanding, always aware. Colton caught those eyes once, across the table. They met for half a second. She nodded, slow and sure. He nodded back. Then came the accident. It was late afternoon, sun dipping low, shadows growing longer. The cattle were being corralled after a long day on the range. One of the older hands, Elias, a man who had worked the Harlow range since Colton was a boy, was coaxing a nervous gelding into the gate. The horse reared. A hoof caught Elias hard in the side. He crumpled, blood pooling from his thigh, where a jagged rip opened like a second mouth. The yard fell into chaos. Men shouted. Someone ran for water. Colton rushed forward, panic flashing in his normally unreadable face. But June was already there. She dropped to her knees beside Elias, tore open the fabric and pressed her hand firm against the wound. "Get me thread. And a fire poker. Now." The cook hesitated. She snapped, "Now!" Colton blinked, stepped back, then ran. Within minutes she had sewn the wound shut with a surgeon's hand. Her fingers never trembled. When she pressed the hot metal to cauterize the worst of it, Elias passed out. June held his hand the whole time. By nightfall, Elias was resting, feverish but alive. Colton stood at the doorway, watching her mop the sweat from the old man's brow. "You done this before?" he asked, voice low. June did not look at him. "My mother was a midwife. I learned watching her bleed men back to life." He did not answer. But something passed between them then. Recognition, maybe, or memory. Because years ago, Colton had watched another woman, his wife, do the same. Steady hands, fierce mercy, the kind of strength that did not need volume. That night, Colton walked back to the house slower than usual, like something inside him had been turned, just slightly, toward warmth. Days passed like dust over the prairie, slow, quiet, but always moving. June did not speak much, but her presence made itself known in ways words could not match. After dinner, while the other hands scattered for cards and pipe smoke, June stayed behind to clean. She folded the oilcloth table cover with careful precision, smoothing each edge before placing it into the crate beside the basin. No one asked her to, no one thanked her, but she did it every night. One evening, as Colton stood from the table, his old handkerchief slipped from his coat pocket. He did not notice. But June did. She picked it up, cotton, faded blue embroidery at the corner, and tucked it into her apron. Later, when the others had gone to sleep, she soaked it gently in warm water, scrubbed it with salt and lye, then hung it by her lantern to dry. The next day, it reappeared on the porch railing, neatly folded, not a word spoken. Colton paused when he saw it. He looked around. No one in sight. He picked it up, held it to his chest for a long moment, and then slipped it back into his coat. That night he dreamed of his wife, the way she used to fold napkins into birds, the way she never filled silence with noise, only presence. He woke before dawn with a lump in his throat and a strange ache beneath his ribs. June kept working. When the post office sent a letter marked urgent, Colton stared at it without moving. It was addressed from Austin, lawyers, likely. He hated lawyers. June said, "I can write it back if you like. They will want a response." "It is 20 miles and storm clouds are coming," he replied. "I have ridden worse." He nodded once. She left before sunrise and returned after dark, hair soaked, coat stiff with hail. She handed him the reply, dry inside her saddlebag. He said nothing. She did not expect him to. Later, Colton found her drying her boots near the stove. He noticed a long red welt down her forearm, an ice burn from the storm, but she hid it under her sleeve when she saw him look. He wanted to say something. Instead, he brought her a bowl of stew, set it in front of her, and walked away. That night, thunder rolled heavy across the land. The shutters clattered. The wind shrieked down the chimney. Most of the hands were already in bed, snoring or muttering through dreams. Colton sat on the porch, legs stretched, hat low over his face, the remnants of a bottle beside him. He had not drunk much, but the wind made the house feel tight. Out here he could breathe. He drifted off. When he stirred, it was still dark, but the wind had softened. A blanket rested over his shoulders, warm, freshly pulled from the bunkhouse. He blinked toward the door, and there, just disappearing into the dark, he caught the edge of a braid. Tung. She had not said his name. She never did. And yet, somehow, she always knew when to step closer and when to step back. 2 nights later, Colton waited until the bunkhouse emptied. He walked to the shed where June stayed, holding a small box of tools. The door creaked as he opened it. The latch on her door had been broken for weeks. He had seen her wedge a piece of wood each night to hold it shut. She never complained, never asked for help. He knelt and replaced the knob with a new one, oiled, smooth, working. He sanded the edges so they would not catch, and tested it twice to make sure it latched clean. He left before she returned. The next evening she entered the shed and paused. Her eyes fell to the doorknob. She reached out, slowly, turned it once. It clicked shut with a soft, perfect sound. June stood there for a long time, hand on the metal, heart catching in her chest. She did not speak of it. But the next morning, when she handed Colton his coffee, she let her fingers rest an extra second against his. Just one. He noticed. Neither of them smiled. But something, somewhere, began to thaw. The rain that spring had been sparse, and the grass on the western edge of the pasture was beginning to yellow. Colton stood with his hands on his hips, surveying the brittle ground. June came up beside him, wiping her hands on her trousers, eyes squinting into the wind. "Do you ever thought of cutting a new water line from the North Spring?" she asked. He turned to her. "That creek's 1/2 mile uphill. But it's higher than this field. If you dig a shallow trench and let it flow natural, gravity'll do the work. It would feed the root beds faster, and we would not lose any calves when summer heat hits." He studied her face. She was not guessing, she knew. "You draw it out," he said. "We'll ride it." Muhammadhed Hatemla. The next morning she handed him a map, hand-sketched, detailed, smart. He blinked at it once before folding it into his pocket. They saddled up and rode north. It was the first time in years Colton had taken anyone with him to check the land. He had always ridden alone, preferred it that way. But June rode beside him without chattering, her gaze moving over the fields like she was memorizing every bend and tree line. When they reached the top of the northern ridge, she pointed out where the creek bent low and how the slope could be leveraged without needing to build anything artificial. Colton nodded, impressed despite himself. They sat under the shade of a lone cedar tree, the horses grazing nearby. June took off her hat, wiped her brow, and said, "My mama died coughing blood. I was 10. She said it was just a chill, but I think she knew. She would not go to a doctor. Said she had already paid her price." Colton looked down at the dirt. "My father came here after she passed, took whatever job he could find. He liked this place. Said the sky looked honest here. Said Mr. Harlow paid fair." He said nothing, but the name hit him hard. "My father died for your herd," she continued. "Some people would be bitter about that. I am not. I think he died doing what he believed in." Colton swallowed. He was a good man. Silence stretched between them. Then, softly, Colton said, "My wife died in that house. Giving birth. The baby came too early. I was in the barn when it happened. By the time I got inside, it was over. Both of them. Just gone." June turned her face toward him. "She wanted to plant lavender by the window," he added, voice quiet. "Said it would keep the nightmares out. I never got around to it." The sun dipped lower, bleeding color across the prairie. They sat in stillness. Then June reached out and laid her hand flat against his chest, just over his heart. "Nothing ever dies," she whispered. "Not if someone remembers." Colton looked at her, really looked. Not as a worker, not as a girl passing through, but as someone who had been carved by loss the way he had, and still chose to stay open. For the first time, the idea of her staying did not feel like a disruption. It felt like healing. The moon hung thin and high over the prairie the night they came. No warning, no signs. Just a flicker of movement at the edge of the fence line, and then the crack of fire. The first explosion jolted the bunkhouse awake. Flames roared through the eastern barrier, licking high into the sky as dry wood caught fast. The cattle screamed, their hooves churning up dust and panic. Gunshots cracked in the distance, wild, unfocused, meant to scatter and terrify. Colton burst through the main house door, rifle in hand. He shouted orders to the hands who stumbled into the yard, still pulling on boots and belts. "They're here for the herd," someone yelled. "From the ridge." Colton scanned the chaos. Shadows moved in the dark, 6, maybe 8 riders, masked, guns raised. They were driving the cattle toward the low ravine, hoping to force a stampede south, out of the Harlow range. He fired once, dropping a horse. The rider tumbled, but another replaced him immediately. "We do not have the numbers," one hand gasped. "We cannot hold them at the line." Colton gritted his teeth. The herd was already pushing, eyes wide with terror, ready to break and run. Then June appeared. She rode in from the side, hair unbound, eyes blazing. The bay stallion Devil's Echo snorted beneath her, reins loose, muscles quivering like thunder waiting to strike. "You said that ravine opens west," she shouted to Colton. "There is a choke between 2 rocks, narrow as a fence gate." Colton nodded once. "It leads to the canyon bend." "Good," she said. "I will take them through it." He stared at her, stunned. "You will be riding blind in a dust storm." "I have ridden worse." Before he could argue, she was gone, kicking her horse hard, galloping straight into the heart of the herd. The others watched, frozen. She howled. It was not a scream, it was something older, wilder, a sound that split the sky and jerked the cattle to attention. She swung a coiled rope above her head, guiding the lead steer hard to the left, away from the attackers. The cattle followed. Dust exploded upward as hundreds of hooves beat the earth, the entire herd shifting like one massive creature under her command. Gunshots rang again, but they were too late, too wide. The cattle swept past the flaming fence, down into the ravine. Colton raised his rifle and covered her flank, shooting once, then twice, picking off the last of the riders who tried to pursue. In the smoke and haze, he caught a glimpse of her, standing in the stirrups, wind in her face, driving that terrified mass through the chokehold of stone like she was born for it. The rest of the men scrambled to follow the herd's path, leaving only Colton standing alone in the ruined yard. The fire still burned at the east line. Ash floated in the air like black snow. The gate hung twisted, half torn from its hinges, but the cattle were safe. She had saved them. He lowered his rifle. For years, Colton had believed the land would take everything from him. It had taken his father, his brothers, his wife. He thought love made men weak, and weakness got men killed. But as he watched the dust rise beyond the canyon and imagined her silhouette against the firelight, fearless, defiant, alive, he felt something crack deep inside his chest. It was not fear. It was awe, and something close to hope. The attack left scars, but it also left whispers. In the days that followed, the herd settled, the fires were put out, and the hands returned to their work. But in town, tongues wagged with a vengeance. They called her the girl who rode thunder. Some meant it with awe, others with suspicion. In the saloon, over whiskey and half-truths, the story twisted. The cold baron took in a young cowgirl. He lets her sleep in the old shed, but whose bed is she really in? She rides his horse, runs his land. Next thing she will run him too. June never went to town. She felt the eyes from a distance. But Colton heard the words himself when he rode in for supplies. A pair of old ranchers leaned near the feed store, voices low but not quiet enough. Man loses a wife, that's one thing, but you see the way he looks at that girl? Looks? Hell, she is probably running that ranch. Harlow is soft now, needs a woman to fix his fences. Colton walked past them without a word, but his jaw tightened. Things worsened when a man named Levi Rusk rode in, a cousin on Colton's mother's side, long estranged, slick hair and sharper tongue. He brought with him papers, land claims, and a smile full of teeth. "You are slipping, Colton," Levi said in the parlor, hat still on. "Letting gossip run your legacy into the dirt. Best clean house while you still got one. The girl, what's her name, June? Let her go. You do not want your name tied to hers. Or your land." Colton said nothing. Levi smirked. "Your father would not have stood for it." Colton rose slowly. "My father died poor. I built this ranch." Levi tapped the deed papers on the table. "So, keep it, but clean the stain." That night, Colton did not sleep. He sat by the window, watching the fields. June moved across them, even in the dark, checking the troughs, brushing the horses, a lantern in her hand. She looked like she belonged there, like she had always been part of this land, even if the world refused to see it. The next morning, Colton saddled his horse before sunrise. He rode to the county registrar's office in Amarillo. The clerk looked up when he entered. "Need to renew your title, Mr. Harlow?" "No," Colton said. "I am here to amend it." He slid the deed across the counter. "Add a name," he said. "June Haynes, full rights, co-manager of all active operations." The clerk blinked. "You sure about that?" "I would not be here if I wasn't." He signed it in ink, hands steady. 2 days later, June found the entry herself. She had gone into the office to pick up shipment receipts. The ledger sat open on the desk, and her eyes caught her own name, spelled clearly beneath Colton's. She stared at it for a long time, the rest of the room fading. That evening she waited on the porch until he came in from the southern field. Her hands trembled, but she did not hide them. "Why did you do it?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. Colton set down his gloves, looked at her fully. "Because," he said slowly, "I have never wanted anyone to stay before. Not until you." She opened her mouth, closed it, then stepped forward. She did not cry, but something in her face cracked wide open. He reached out, took her hand in his, and held it like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. And in that moment, maybe it was. The morning came, soft and pale, the sky just beginning to blush with light, as though the sun itself were shy to rise on something so sacred. There were no ribbons strung across gates, no white chairs in rows, no music drifting through tall chapel windows. Just a hush, a sacred, reverent stillness broken only by the low hum of bees waking among the wildflowers that had begun to bloom along the edge of the southern pasture. It smelled of earth and lavender, of promise stitched into soil. June wore no white. She stood barefoot in the dew-damp grass, her toes curled slightly in the cold, wearing an old, faded dress that had once belonged to her mother. It was sky pure, with threadbare hems and a patch just above the knee, repaired long ago with stitches more practical than pretty. In her hand, folded neatly, was a handkerchief with initials stitched in crooked red thread. W.H., her father's. She had kept it close through years of drifting and labor, a relic of where she came from and what she had survived. Colton stood beside her, solemn and steady. He wore the cleanest shirt he owned, white with faint blue stripes, sleeves rolled to his forearms. His hair had been combed, but the wind had already undone most of the effort. There was no boutonniere, no silver tie, no polished boots or family heirloom cufflinks. Just the man, as he was, weathered, lean, silent, and somehow more whole than he had ever been. Behind them stood the old well, dry for nearly a decade, its stone rim wrapped in moss and memory. Once Colton's late wife had dreamed of turning it into a flower bed, but it had remained untouched. He had never brought himself to change it, but now, standing there with June beside him, it no longer felt like a monument to grief. It felt like something dormant, patiently waiting to bloom again. The preacher who stood before them was a retired circuit rider, his back bent from years on horseback and his voice gravelly with dust and time. His Bible was worn soft at the edges, pages yellowed like prairie straw. "We gather not in grandeur," he said, lifting his eyes to the pale sky, "but in grace. Two souls, carved by loss, choosing each other in a world that never promised second chances." There were no crowds, no pews of polished faces. The only witnesses were a mutt that barked once and wagged his tail the rest of the time, and a small knot of neighbor children who had climbed up the outer fence, wide-eyed and barefoot, their breath held as if watching something magical unfold. June smiled at them. Colton remained still when the preacher asked if he had anything to say. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his vest and drew out a small object wrapped in cloth. Unfolding it carefully, he revealed a ring. Not gold, not silver, but iron. Dark and dulled, its shape slightly imperfect. "I made it," he said, voice quiet as the wind. "From a horseshoe. Bent it myself over the forge." He paused. "Because nothing bent by pressure is ever quite the same again. But sometimes, it holds better than it used to." June's breath caught as she took the ring with trembling fingers, her hand already extended before he even offered it. She slid it onto her own finger, no hesitation, no fanfare. It fit. Just right. When it was her turn, she looked straight at him, eyes clear and unflinching. "I came here with nothing," she said, voice catching slightly. "But I found everything." The preacher smiled, nodding once as he closed the Bible gently. "Then by earth and by sky," he said, "you are what this land needed, husband and wife." The mutt barked again, louder this time. One of the children behind the fence clapped before catching herself and tucking her hand shyly behind her back. Colton turned to June. She looked at him, really looked. And in that moment, she did not see the legend, the landowner, or the widower. She saw the man who had quietly mended her door, who rode through smoke to cover her flank, who added her name in ink where it mattered most. He reached for her hand. Their fingers laced easily, like they had done it 100 times before. And together they walked back toward the ranch house, not to music, not to cheers or rise or ribbons, but to the soft hush of prairie grass beneath their feet and the wind blowing warm for once, carrying with it a promise neither had expected but both now carried home. The seasons turned, and with them the land did too. 1 year later, The Harlow Ranch was no longer the silent stretch of dust it had once been. The cattle were strong and glossy, the fields greener than anyone remembered. The western slope, where once only thorns grew, now bloomed with clover and prairie aster. Children's laughter echoed from the round pen where June taught riding lessons on Sunday afternoons. She would kneel in the dirt beside the smallest of them, showing how to tie a lead rope or stroke a skittish colt. Her voice was calm, steady, confident in a way that made even the wildest horses seem tame. Inside the main house, things had changed too. The room Colton had left empty all those years, the one with the boarded window, now held a shelf of books, a reading chair, and a lace curtain that fluttered in the breeze. June had stitched it herself. The room smelled of cedar and new beginnings. It had been his wife's dream once. Now it was hers too. Colton still rose before dawn, still walked the perimeter of his land with quiet watchfulness, but the weight he carried no longer dragged behind him like a broken gate. It lifted in small ways. A smile as he passed, a hand fixing a fence, a word of praise offered without prompting, a hand resting briefly at the small of June's back as she passed him with a bucket of feed. And then, one day, he wrote a letter. He had not done that in years, not since the last one, to a lawyer, to a cemetery, to a God he did not speak to anymore. But this letter was different. To whoever finds this, my name is Colton Harlow. I once believed this land had taken everything from me, my family, my voice, my reason to build anything but fences. But a girl came riding across my fields one day, a girl with fire in her step and her father's ghost in her spine. She asked for work. What she gave me was breath, and breath turned to hope. I did not think I could be loved again. But she proved love does not wait for permission. It simply shows up and stays, like wind, like rain after a hard drought. Her name is June Haynes, and I owe her not just the land, I owe her my life. C.H. He folded it, sealed it, and placed it on the bookshelf beside the old tin box where he kept his wife's letters. He did not burn them. He never would. But now there was room for another name beside his own. That evening, as dusk fell in long golden streaks across the field, Colton stepped onto the porch. He held something in his hand, a handkerchief, crisp and new. Stitched into one corner were the initials C.H. And right beside them, in finer thread, smaller but no less permanent, J.H. He looked up. Across the open pasture, June rode bareback on Devil's Echo, hair streaming behind her, laughter on her lips. She rode like the wind had chosen her, free, fierce, and utterly unafraid. Colton did not wave. He only stood there, handkerchief clutched tight, heart thudding in his chest like it had rediscovered a rhythm long forgotten. And for the first time in a long, long time, he breathed. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the dust, the silence, the firelight flicker between two broken hearts who dared to love again, then saddle up and stay with us. This is just one of many Wild West love stories we bring to life. Tales of resilience, romance, and redemption set against the untamed beauty of the American frontier. Unforgettable journeys, where love rides hard, stays true, and always finds a way home. Until next time, partner, ride safe, love deep, and never forget, even in the loneliest land, love can bloom like wildflowers in the dust.